Check, sound check. That sounds pretty good. Okay, are we on? Yeah. Welcome to the prayer class, the odd prayer class, auditorium prayer class. We are in week 12, and we're going to finish out the month of August, and then we have a new class lined up for you here that you can come and check out online or on scene. And we've been looking at the prayers of Jesus, and I'll say this again because I've learned that sometimes people are tuning in for the first time or they're checking out one of these. And by the way, if you're watching this video at a different time, thank you for being here. I'm glad that this is going to be useful to you. I hope it's going to be useful to you, and I always welcome the feedback. Just to give a bit of a view of where we're at and what we're doing, because if somebody's picking this video out of others, they need to know this. You know, as an aside, that's why Marvel Comics was so successful in the 60s and 70s, because Stan Lee used to say, every Marvel comic is somebody's first Marvel comic. So he always wanted to give the background in every comic so that then people would be hooked and they would keep coming back. So here's your Marvel comic synopsis. We've looked at prayers in Scripture, and these are my notes for my own study of prayer, and I'm sharing them with you because if it's helpful to me, maybe it'll be helpful to you. But I encourage you to take these notes, to take this teaching and use it in whatever way it helps you explore prayer. I think that prayer is something that we have to workshop constantly. We are always going to be learners in prayer. We never arrive and have some sort of specific, prayer understanding that never changes. That denies the whole idea of a relationship. Prayer is about a relationship. We've looked at past lessons, how sometimes we view prayer as nothing more than a psychological boost, and sometimes we view it as a spell of sorts, and so you have to get the technique right, and if you don't get the technique right, then the prayer doesn't get answered exactly so. Prayer is none of those, but prayer is a way of addressing and acknowledging that we participate in a relationship with God. And when Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray, he actually teaches them about the nature of God and reminds them who it is that they will be praying to. So we have the Lord's Prayer. And in that particular instruction of the Lord's Prayer, we've noticed some things that may or may not be a part of our own prayer life. And then we've looked at Jesus' own prayers, where he will lift his eyes up to heaven and he will pray. It's like he's reaching out to his Father, and he's asking his Father to enact his will on earth just as it is done in heaven. But then he'll get specific about that. And so for the last few weeks, we've looked at John 17. In John 17, Jesus is praying for his own glory, that he might be glorified, that his disciples might be glorified, that they would be glorified in that they would be protected, they would be unified, and then in that, they will be a representation of his glory so that the world might believe. Jesus has a vision for them and for what God will do, and he's praying that that will be. So, Jesus prayed for us, and now we're invited into this relationship of prayer. There's a lot of time that has gone down the river, gone under the bridge, a lot of water under the bridge since the time that Jesus prayed until now. And prayer has always been a part of the practice of the church. For better or for worse, it's been a part of the practice of the church. It's been what we've done. And there's a lot of different types of prayers that have been written and published. Some of them look very similar to biblical prayers. Some of them look very different. You can go pick up a prayer book anywhere that might include famous prayers or not so famous prayers, prayers that are used in churches, prayers that are used by believers. And again, the same tendencies are there. Some of these prayers will be written almost as spell books. You know, here's the kind of prayer that you pray over a person in this situation. Here's the kind of prayer you pray in a person over in this situation. Now, in the sense of giving us a prompt or giving us a template so that we might know, like, how do I pray for someone in the hospital? How do I pray for someone who's ill and maybe we've been told that their condition is terminal? I mean, do I go in there and pray for healing? Is that cruel? Am I faithless if I don't? I'm not going to give you a pat, easy answer to all of those. It's different. Just real quickly, what I've often found is the best thing to do is if you are praying for someone, ask them, how might I pray for you? Because then it becomes a relationship between you and that person, and it includes God. And maybe even when they say, I don't know how I want you to pray for me, I just want you to pray. That might be enough. Or maybe you can offer what you're thinking. Well, I keep feeling like I need to pray for this. I know I need that too. There's different ways to go about that. It calls for a lot of wisdom. It calls for kindness. And it calls for faith, which is trust in this case. And we trust one another and we trust God. But the idea that there are prayers that, hey, I can pray this prayer and you'll get a specific kind of financial blessing, or I can pray this prayer and you can get this particular, relationship that you've been hoping for. If our only goal is to, and this is my phrase, is to get the goodies, then we turn God into a magic genie, and that's not the way it works. But if the goal is to express these things as children would to a parent and to say, Father, we're going to trust all of this to you, and we're going to name this together, or I'm going to name this myself, but we're going to trust, then I think we're very much in the spirit of Jesus in Gethsemane when he was praying, Father, this is what I want. Nevertheless, your will, not mine, be done. Now, he understood what God's will was, but he was still praying for what he willed. But he was also surrendering his will to God's so that they might be one. And it really makes sense of that John 17 prayer if you think about it. So, there's been a lot of prayers, and we won't have time to look at all these, but I want to look at some of them. Because some of them are so popular and they're so familiar and used, I think it might be good to compare these. I don't think we have to just jettison some prayer because it's not in the Bible. I think it's worth looking at. What's the difference between somebody's published prayer and you or I extemporaneously praying? Now, that's a big word. That just means praying on the spot. What's the difference? Well, there's no difference. You've just composed one right there on the spot. Somebody else has composed one somewhere else. Yours isn't necessarily better. It's not necessarily worse, but hey, who's going to judge? As long as we're praying to God with sincere hearts, I think we're in the right mode. And sometimes it helps us to have some training wheels on our prayers, that we're learning how prayer works. One of those that you're going to see quite often is the Serenity Prayer. You've seen this. It gets embroidered on things. It gets posted online a lot. This is from somebody's Twitter post. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And then it always ends with Reinhold Niebuhr. What's that? Is that some magic word in another language that makes this prayer, because you see that a lot, Reinhold Niebuhr. And if you don't know who Reinhold Niebuhr is, you might not even know that that's a who. This prayer is very familiar, and it's been popular in the 20th century. I'm wearing my CR shirt today. We use this prayer at the end of every CR meeting. But it doesn't look exactly like this. And we don't say Reinhold Niebuhr. And, but I find Reinhold Niebuhr very interesting. I'm going to get to, in fact, let's just jump ahead. Let's talk about Reinhold Niebuhr. Who is Reinhold Niebuhr? Well, this nappy-looking fellow right here is Reinhold Niebuhr. He, and here's the thing. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't. If you were around in the middle of the 20th century, you probably heard about him. In fact, Niebuhr, among others, appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Now, can you imagine that? 1948 issue of Time magazine. They've got a minister and theologian on the front cover. I mean, that happened a lot in American history, that your preachers and your theological scholars were people who were noticed. Who's the last purveyor of theology that any of us have noticed outside of scandal? Who's been featured in the news or in the media outside of scandal? You might help me with that sometime, but right now the only one I'm thinking of is Oprah. And seems to be what most people think. Probably, but you don't see it outside of scandal. But it comes up and from time to time. But here's the thing: in the 40s, people, there were scandals that surrounded Niebuhr, but they were more ideological scandals, like, what is it that he's saying? They would bring him into the debate the way they bring people in, from the left and the right, the red and the blue. Because Niebuhr had views over time that would change. And he's a growing figure throughout time. But they would bring him in mainly because of his ideas. And people cared about what he thought, not whatever the scandal was. Niebuhr was, now he also has a brother named Richard Niebuhr, and sometimes their works get confused. But Reinhold Niebuhr starts in the 1910s as a pastor of German American churches in the Midwest, really in Detroit. And he's born in America. He's born in Wright City, Missouri, right outside of St. Louis. Maybe that's why it's called Wright City, because it's right outside St. Louis. No, that's not true. Anyway, look, I don't tell many jokes, but I think you'll agree that the ones I do tell are so-so. Anyway, he pastors these churches where you have these large groups of German-speaking people. And in the early 20th century, there were waves of German immigrants, and many of them spoke the language of back home. In fact, I had a guy in Lake Jackson tell me a story once. We had a lot of German immigrants down there around the 1930s, 1940s. And their family, they were listening to the radio. They were picking up wireless. This is right around 1942, 43. There was a little thing going on back then called World War II. It was in all the papers. And turned out the Germans were kind of the bad guys. So they're listening to broadcasts in German on their wireless radio set. And somebody calls the sheriff and says, "We've got German spies out there listening to German radio." And he said, No. They're just picking up broadcasts from somewhere in Europe, free Europe or something like that. I mean, don't worry about it. And a lot of that would happen. But you'd have these little Lawrence Welk, his first language, he born in Wisconsin. His first language is German. That's why he has the accent. But Niebuhr can speak German, so he goes into these German-American communities, and he's preaching, and he's doing his work there. And some of his writings come from that time period where he admires the faith of these people. And then later on, he becomes a professor of practical theology at Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan. Now, during the World Wars, Niebuhr had, I think this is what put Niebuhr in the spotlight on the American scene, because he took a stand on some things. In the 1920s, there were movements in America, religious Protestant movements, to close the borders and to deal with all these immigrants and to make sure that Christianity took a stand against this. we wouldn't know anything about that kind of stuff today. But anyway, they would do this, and they were called the Black Legion, and there was another little group called the Ku Klux Klan. I don't know, maybe you've heard of them. And yeah, they were active in Detroit. So everybody who thinks that, oh, Klan, that's Alabama, right? No, in fact, one of their largest enclaves in the 1920s was in Indiana. Again, it was a movement. Niebuhr challenged that. I've heard stories, I've read stories, I've had people tell me stories about, you'd have a Christian assembly, and in would march the Klan, and they would bring money and donations, and they say, we want to support this church because you're standing against the evil of all this, and you got these ministers. There's even letters written to Churches of Christ, periodicals, where people say, the Klan, wants to do this. And God bless the editors of those magazines, because they would say, hey, we do not need to be involved in that kind of politics, or any kind of politics is really the way they would draw the line. But you can see that it was recognized as dangerous even by conservative-minded people. So this wasn't a conservative liberal thing. As Niebuhr pointed out, it's a matter of hate and love. It's a matter of kindness or bullying. So he opposed what was going on in Detroit. He actually opposed Nazism in Germany, and though he was a pacifist, he said realistically somebody's going to have to do something about this, or it's going to threaten Christianity. There's a lot to that story, but he's torn by what he sees with his heritage back in Germany, and you've got national churches, you've got churches that are saying, hey, we support the principles of Nazism. These are so-called Protestant Christian churches, and they support this. Why? Because they've cozied up to the government in such a way that they are implicit in what the government wants to do. Not everybody. There was opposition, and that's another story for another time, but look up Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church of Germany during World War II. Those are heroic stories. It cost people their lives to oppose what was definitely sin. Anyway, sometime in the 1930s, we don't really, it's sort of elusive, but probably as early as 1932, Niebuhr composes what's called the Serenity Prayer. He never called it that. We do know that he used it in sermons in the 1940s, and then it was published in 1951, and that's where it's definitely attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr. It's published in a magazine, a Christian magazine. But the history suggests that Alcoholics Anonymous picked it up in 1941, that it had been published without any attribution to Niebuhr, and Alcoholics Anonymous is really taking off in 1941 as the first notable 12-step program, and there's a whole other history of it where you can see that they're drawing from Christian principles, and they're really drawing from principles of sort of getting back to New Testament teaching. It's almost like a 20th century restoration movement in a sense. But as early as 1941, one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous finds this prayer published in, I think it was in the New York Tribune, and says, hey, we've never seen so much of the 12 steps encapsulated in so short of a writing. And I think that's how they adopted it and picked it up, so that it's very common. You'll even see it on AA coins printed, just that short version of it that we looked at. But there is a longer version of it. This is the version that's often used in recovery groups today. And it sounds like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now that's the opening section of it. And that's usually what gets taken out and given as the short version. But there's much more to it. There's much more to it. And the way to follow this prayer is to notice the verbs. Living, there's your first verb, one day at a time. Enjoying, one moment at a time. Accepting hardship as a pathway to peace. Taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. I think the prayer has caught on because for so many people who find themselves in difficult, trying situations, this prayer is very centering. It centers us back on God and on Jesus and on the mind of Christ. And it guides us to do something much larger than cast the prayer spell that gets us what we want, or it's actually pushing us to do a little bit more than get the psychological boost that we need. There's language of surrender, of acceptance, but also of courage and grace, or serenity. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting then to analyze this? And so, using the Lord's Prayer as that template prayer that Jesus gives us, as that basic prayer. I'm going to say this again in the sermon this morning. There are those few occasions where Jesus will give us a set of instructions. And usually Jesus will give us a parable and tell us about the kingdom. I'm not putting that down. I think that's actually, he's Jesus. He knows what he's doing. I'm not going to. But, usually he'll give us a parable that invites us and opens us up to the realities of the kingdom of heaven. Sometimes he might give us instruction like he does in the Sermon on the Mount. But even there, the specifics are meant to illustrate the whole. So that when he's telling us, hey, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say that if you, look on a woman to lust, then you've committed adultery in your heart. Now, Jesus isn't just laying out a specific definition for adultery there, but he's using that and a lot of others to say, look, do you understand? It's not just about your external behavior, but it's also about your internal development and nature and spirit. Jesus is raising the bar so that in each of those he's showing. He says, you've heard it said, do not murder, but I tell you, don't even be angry with your brother. He's pushing the bar higher so that he can say in verse 20 of Matthew 5, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you can't enter into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is showing us that it's more about just what we do or don't do out there. It's what happens in here. He does the same thing in other teachings about clean and unclean food. So, say all that to say, here's Jesus giving us this specific instruction that when they ask him, how should we pray? He says, well, pray like this. To see Jesus give us that much detail, and he'll do it also in Matthew 18, where he says, here's a process, and he talks about reconciling ourselves to one another, resolving conflicts. All right, so we pay a lot of attention to this Lord's Prayer because he's laying out and giving us something very specific that's worth meditating on. And then here's this Serenity Prayer, written by a man who believes the gospel, trusts in Jesus, and promotes the worship and discipleship of Jesus, a man who's interested about the things of God. All right, Niebuhr. How can we compare them? Well, first of all, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can. It sounds a lot like, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That when Jesus teaches us how to pray, he says, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to pray that God's will be done. And when you pray for God's will to be done, what are we asking for? Are we asking for God's will to be done in us? Or are we asking for God's will to be done in others or in the world around us? I think the answer is yes. We're asking that his will be done. That in whatever should happen, in whatever we may do, it will submit to and follow and participate in God's will in this world. That's what Jesus is praying when he prays that the Father's will be done in the crucifixion. It's Before Jesus, it's impossible to see how the crucifixion participates in the will of God. People didn't just walk by there were crucifixions before Jesus. People didn't walk by those and say, well, I don't know why those guys were crucified, but that's definitely God's will. They would never think that. It would be a horrific sight. It would be scandalous. It would obviously be a symbol of intimidation and threat from the Roman government. But Jesus understands that even that intimidation by the empire can be used to accomplish God's purposes and God's will. Amazing. But to do that, that means, okay, I wish that His will would be done in my life, and I wish that His will would be done in the world around me. Niebuhr has done us a favor by separating this out into two categories. I guess there's the things that we can do and the things that we can't do. So for the things that we're not able to do, he asks us for the serenity to accept those. Hey, what often leads us into sin, anxiety, and worry is getting caught up in those things that we can't change. Sometimes I know I can do my part, but sometimes it's beyond me. And yet that's the thing that will get us all upset. I'm just all upset about the world today. Why? Well, it's those people over there in that other country who are doing this, that, and the other, and that's affecting the economy. Well, what are you going to do about it? Run over to that nation, put up your dukes, and threaten to fight every one of them? It's not going to go well. We get caught up in these big things that we can, even in the lives of our loved ones. We wish that they would stop doing things to hurt themselves. We wish that other people would stop hurting them. If you've ever been a parent, you know this. You send your kids off to school, and the other kids are picking on them or, behaving like kids are. And again, we all want to rush in and protect them. And I get it. We got to at certain points. But when it's just that name-calling nonsense and all that, you can either fight their battles for them or you can teach them how to overcome all of that. And that's tough. But we have to accept that there are certain limitations. And when we understand those limitations, we might just be doing better for ourselves and for everybody else. Niebuhr separated this out. You need the courage to do what you can do. Let me give you an example of how this works practically. I've been a student of this Serenity Prayer for a few years now. And I was praying through it during a very difficult time for our family. And I kept praying. I said, God, give me serenity to accept what I can't change. Give me serenity to accept what I can't change. Now, God, I need that serenity. I'm not getting that serenity, but I need that serenity to accept what I can't change. And what I was implying in that was I was playing, God, can you change it? Because I think when you change it to my satisfaction, I'm going to get some serenity. So I kept praying the prayer, God, grant me serenity to accept things that cannot change. See, and you pray it with gritted teeth, and that's a bad sign. Grant me serenity to accept things that cannot change, and the courage to change the things. Oh. I was praying for a hammer, and God was handing me a screwdriver, see? And because I needed to loosen some things up. But I kept taking the hammer, trying to hammer all the things that were screwed up in my life back into the wall. That wisdom to know the difference, because what I was struggling through was something where, oh, I get it now. I don't need serenity, I need courage. Yeah, there's some changes that need to be made. It's time to make the changes. Time to make the changes. And you know what came after that courage? Serenity. Because I knew that God was going to take care of me. But I'd had to make some difficult choices. Well enough. But this is where I think Niebuhr has taken this biblical concept and he's just fleshed it out. Now, what's all important is that wisdom to know. And I see a lot of similarity between that and the part of the prayer that says, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. If you go back to the Garden of Eden, the temptation is not just to eat that fruit. The temptation is to be like God. The serpent offers it to Eve and to Adam as well. Don't give Adam a pass. He knows what's going on here. Okay, and so he says, hey, did God really say don't touch this? Yeah, he said we'd die. You won't die. You'll be like God. And maybe God could use your help. There's always that temptation to turn this into to turn God's will into our own will. Hey, this could work. And we start wanting to fix things, and we start wanting to manage things. That's the temptation that we get led to, sometimes for the right reasons, but to do the wrong things. Sometimes we think that a little bit of joy, a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of fun, it's just going to help us. It's just going to help us. Sometimes we think that just, well, hey, we'll just love people and tell them that whatever they want to do is going to be okay. We think that's going to work, but it doesn't. And sometimes we need the courage to love, but we need the courage to love in such a way that says, I love you so much, to say, I can't agree with what you're choosing to do. Oh, there's so many different applications of this. But that wisdom that comes from God is what keeps us away from the temptation of overriding His will and delivers us from the temptations of the evil one, which will draw us into a kind of thinking where we replace God's will and God's wisdom for our own. Okay, that's just the opening part of the Serenity Prayer. You go to this part where the verbs kick in. And I think it's important that you have to take this Serenity Prayer as a whole. Don't accept the short version. You're getting cheated. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time. Easy, right? Give us our daily bread. Well, that's not exactly the same. Sure it is. I mean, what is the grace that we say over food? I've always been amazed at prayers over food. Sometimes people will, it can almost become the kind of thing where you pray your grace over the meal, and before that food is dirty and full of curses. But after you pray your prayer, so sometimes I'll come into a meal and somebody will say, "Oh, this food's already been blessed." Well, and did you put salt on it too? Because that's important also. The blessing, and I think it's good, to me it's a sign of gratitude that we're trusting in God that He provides. That, again, it's not a magic spell, but it's a way of saying thank you. And so when I receive this food with a glad heart, when I confirm that with others, we're offering the blessing. But here, Jesus is inviting us to pray as a request for food. God, you know what we need, so please give it to us. Now, I would dare say that for most of us, food is not the major concern of our lives. And if it is, it's a concern about too much food or the wrong kind of food. But remember that in ancient cultures and in cultures around the world even today, whether or not there will be food is still an issue. It's still an issue in this nation as well. But we ask God. For many of us, we can have all the food, we can have so much other material blessings, and what eludes us is the ability to live and enjoy life. Because sometimes we're living in the regrets of the past, and sometimes we're living in the anxieties of the future. But if we can center ourselves on the moment and say, this is the moment I've been given. Notice that it's so interesting that Jesus says, give us today our daily bread. It brings up the idea of manna. Manna was given once a day. There wasn't a manna farm. God could have given them a manna unicorn that would have left manna around everywhere they go. I mean, it doesn't happen like that because God wants them to trust in His daily provision. What if we could trust in God's daily provision for life and enjoyment? Sometimes life has to be enjoyed even when it has to be endured. Now, that's a mature concept right there. But I think we can find enjoyment in that. So I see a lot of similarity between those two. And then part of the maturity in Christ is we learn to accept hardship not as a curse from heaven, but as a pathway to peace. Too often when things go bad for us, we want to claim that either it's just Satan doing some dirty trick, and I would say don't give Satan that much credit, okay? Satan would rather us take the hardships that happen and blame them all on God, or to ignore what we can gain from hardships. Niebuhr here has written this phrase, what if we could accept hardship as a pathway to peace? What if the conflict, what if the struggle, what if the difficult things that we're facing are actually enough to turn us towards a better way? Now remember that Niebuhr lives through 2 world wars. Conflicts that were unique for their time and maybe unique in history. One of the overriding concepts of people of peace, politicians and thinkers who understood the meaning of the war was maybe these conflicts will be enough to inoculate us from the horror of war. Unfortunately, that hasn't been true. But you can see Niebuhr coming out of that history. And so he's got this idea, what if the hardship, what if the difficulty actually leads to something better? You also have the Genesis 50, verse 20 statement of Joseph, who says, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. And I think it's all of those ideas that are wrapped up into this. So that when Jesus says, forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors, notice that Jesus, in saying, forgive us of our debts, God, he's already assuming that we have forgiven those who have something against us. Now, this is not only financial, but this is social, it's psychological, it's all of that. It's spiritual. There are debts of honor. Okay, there are debts of standing. And if you shame someone, you need to make amends for that in ancient cultures. Here he's saying, we're letting all of that go, God. We want you to let it go from us, but we've let it go from others. We've accepted hardship not as the breaking of relationships, but maybe a pathway to peace. Then his next verb, these are 3 of the verbs, living, or 4 of them actually, living, enjoying, accepting, and taking. Taking as Jesus did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. And I think that takes us back to lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. So often our temptation is to change the world, but to do it for all the wrong reasons. It's a strange fact in church history that where the church and where church leaders have often gone wrong is they get so arrogant about converting the world for Jesus that they get out ahead of Jesus. That's a well-intentioned, but it's like, hey, we can do this. We've got enough technology, we've got enough human power, we've got enough funds. Let's go out there and make the world a world for Jesus, and then we define what that looks like because we're doing it not with His power, but with our own. That's a temptation. Got to be very careful about that. Better that we should be humble and powerless and show that this power comes from God. Okay. Trusting, the last verb, that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will. Again, this matches up with your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life. I think that's the sum total of all these other things, the trust in the daily bread, the forgiving us of our debts, the taking us out of temptation and leading us away from the temptations of the evil one. And supremely happy with you forever in the next takes us back to our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. We've got a goal in mind. The Serenity Prayer ends with this. The Lord's Prayer opens with this vision. The Serenity Prayer ends with this vision of being supremely happy with God forever in the next, which, by the way, is one of the things that elevates this Serenity Prayer beyond just a psychological feel-good statement for the moment. No. Jesus has been mentioned, so we're looking at Him and His example and His lordship and the future of being with God forever, eternity, is mentioned. This prayer is participating in much more than just... Now, the short version loses all of that. but the longer version participates in it. And I think that's the opening of the Lord's Prayer, where we open up with this grand vision of God's kingdom come. You know, in some ways that does exist in the church, and yet the church is just a foretaste of these things. It's just a sample of these things. It's the 90-year free trial of eternity if you do it. You know, it's like come and see what it's like. But there's more. There's much more. In the 1951 published version of this prayer, there's a twist, and this is not what you will often see. Like that first version I gave you is what you'll see that we use in Celebrate Recovery meetings. This one's not used very often, but I like this one. God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed. And then if you pick it up, God, give me the courage to change the things, it's not a matter of my ability, but to change the things which should be changed. Wow. That kind of puts a different spin on it. And the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, so that I don't get busy with things that I don't need to be busy with, and I'm focusing on. And there's other biblical concepts. But then you have the same verbs as in the regular longer form. So check out the Serenity Prayer. Maybe you have a favorite prayer that means something to you. Maybe you can do this same thing with that and look back at biblical wisdom. But I invite you to encourage that. In the next 3 weeks, we may find some other prayers, both modern and ancient, and do this treatment on them. But I appreciate your feedback. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for being here today.